Hi, in this module, we're going to build an agent not using the scaffolding but from the scratch. So in simple 6 steps, we'll see how to build an agent that uses a tool. So let's get started. I have my blank editor here. Let me start with the first part, logging level for the agent. So we import certain modules from Google ADK, which includes LLM agent, that is the core building block, and then the in-memory session service, and of course the runner. And I'll explain why we need each of those. We set the logging level to error, and that completes our first part of this code snippet. In the second part, we are going to define the dummy API or the mock API. Now, this is the tool that the agent would use to come back with the weather details. In production environments, you would replace this with real API, but for the demo, this is sufficient. So we have a class called weather result and a dictionary that has key value pairs with the city name and the weather condition. And then there is a function that accepts the city and responds with the actual weather. If we send a key that doesn't exist, we get back an error. So that is the second part of the snippet where we have defined the mock API. Now coming to the third part and the most essential, we actually define the agent. So this is where I point the agent to Gemini 2.5 Flash model, and we instantiate the LLM agent object, set its name, point to the model, and then define description and instruction. Now in the instruction, I explicitly tell the agent to use getWeather tool to answer city weather related questions. If the tool returns an error, explain it politely, otherwise present the report. And finally, we will wire up the getWeather function to the agent tool. Now this is the most crucial step where we actually define the agent. And once we have the agent in place, we also need to define the session and runner objects. So in ADK, we have the concept of a session and a runner. So the session is going to maintain the history and the conversational context as we interact with the agent. And the runner is responsible for the loop that essentially goes through multiple steps in the conversation. That includes getting the input from the user, defining whether the agent should call a tool, and whether the agent has received the final response or not. So think of this as the loop that's responsible for executing the agent. So here we define the application name, the user ID, the session ID, and we instantiate the session service, which is an in-memory session service. This is one of the easiest to use and very simple one to get started with. In production environments, you might want to use a database or Vertex AI memory bank, which will provide long-term persistence. Obviously, this is an in-memory session service that is transient and it not be available once the agent exits. So we define the runner and session service. Next, we create a helper function that is responsible for the loop. So in part 5, we put everything together. So call agent is the function that accepts the query, which is the city name. And then we populate the content by calling types.content, role is user, and we convert the query into content. And then we initialize final text to no final response. And this variable is responsible for holding the final response coming from the agent. And then since ADK is the async first approach or the agentic model, we use async and await everywhere. So this function is an asynchronous function, and here we execute a loop again in asynchronous mode where we pass the user ID, session ID, and the content that is sent by the user, which is the actual city name or the query, and we run this loop as long as the final response is null and the event content is also null. Once they are populated, we gather the final text by going through the event content parts and sending it back to the user. So here we print the final response, and the last part of this is basically defining and invoking the main method. Now that's pretty straightforward. If you're familiar with Python, you can very easily connect or relate with this. Let me save this as weatheragent.py. All right. So now we define async main and we create the session by passing the application name, user ID, and session ID that we defined here. And then we print the session details and the runner for the specific agent. And then we call the agent with 3 different queries: the weather in London, Paris, and New York. But if we go back, we don't have Paris in our dictionary, so obviously it's going to return an error, but the LLM is smart enough to translate that into a user-friendly response and tell that it is not able to respond. So the most important thing here is the session service that we create here, and then invoke the call agent, which we defined here. And this is the execution loop. Now this is going to run as long as the final response is not generated and the event content and event content parts are null. So once they are populated and not null, we gather the final response and print it on screen. So pretty straightforward. Now it's time for us to execute the weather agent. So I've already set the Google API key and I have installed Google ADK with pip install Google ADK. For details on that, refer to my previous video, module 8, where we set up the environment. Now it's time for me to execute weather agent. Now this is different from running ADK web or ADK run because we own the function main and the root agent. So this is an end-to-end approach to creating an agent. So let's wait for this to get executed. First the session is created, then the runner is invoked, and it comes back with the weather in London, which is the dummy data that we populated. Paris, it is very polite in saying that Paris is not a part of its dictionary and we can try one of the available cities. And then it's going to respond with the New York weather because that's a part of the dictionary. So this is an agent which we built from the ground up. And we are not using ADK web or ADK run. We didn't even scaffold the code, but we ended up writing it from scratch. Now the gist for this code is available in the link below. You can access that. And for details on setting up the Google ADK environment and getting started with ADK, you can refer to my previous video, which is module 8. So I hope you found this useful, and I strongly encourage you to copy and paste this code and run it on your machine to get familiar with the session service and the runner loop. And we are going to build upon this as we go along in this journey of mastering ADK. Thanks for watching.